In a town forgotten by time, where tumbleweeds danced across cracked boards and sorrow rode in on every stray breeze, the widow Valdez's farm lay on the edge of oblivion. The low adobe walls, built by Juan Valdez with hands hardened by sun and sorrow, had sheltered generations of his family. Now beneath a bruised sky streaked with ash-gray clouds, the farm smoldered, its once fertile fields surrendered to flickering tongues of flame. Marilena Valdez pressed her hand against her swelling belly and knelt beside the scorched ruins of her orchard. The air tasted of smoke and betrayal. At 6 months pregnant, she should have been tending a cradle of new life within. Yet here she stood amid death's charred remains, her heart heavy with rage and grief. Since her husband's passing 2 years prior, Marilena had carved out a tenuous peace. Each dawn found her before the ramshackle barn, milking the old mare, coaxing life from stubborn earth. Every dusk she laid her head on a pillow stuffed with dreams of her baby's laughter, of a future unburdened by loss. But that fragile promise was shattered when the gang rolled in before sunrise thugs with eyes colder than the river in midwinter, boots that stomped down hope as easily as they trampled wheat. She recalled the moment she heard the first gunshot. The echo had rolled across the canyon, rattling her shutters. Flames licked the horizon before any of the neighbors dared to flee. By the time the smoke drifted toward the town, the farm was already a ruin. Marilena rose slowly, every movement careful and deliberate. The world blurred around her. Her breath caught as she blinked tears from her lashes. Each gasp reminded her of the life growing inside. Her fingers curled, knuckles paling. "They've taken everything," she whispered, her voice a brittle whisper against the roar of the wind. "Everything but hope." She cradled her belly, feeling the baby shift, as if answering her unspoken vow. Somewhere beyond the ashes, the law had his eye on the culprits. But the sheriff's long ride from Carson Hill meant little when blood and flame had already been spilled. Marilena's gaze drifted to the faint outline of the chapel steeple on the horizon, where Father Alejo lit a candle each evening in prayer for the town's broken souls. She thought of the letter she had hidden beneath loose floorboards, a scrawled missive from a figure known as the Prairie Shadow, the West's most feared duelist, promising justice to any widow who suffered at lawless hands. For nights, she'd stared at that promise in trembling candlelight. Doubt had whispered that such legends died in dusty gunfights long ago. Yet now, standing amid ruin, she dared to believe the wind carried a distant clatter of horseshoes on timber. Her heart thundered in her chest. No more running, she vowed, no more hiding. With the fire's glow still warm on her cheeks, Marilena Valdez began the journey that would test every ounce of her courage. Each step away from the only home she'd known felt like tearing muscle from bone, but her resolve burned brighter than any blaze. Beyond the crest of the hill, the silhouettes of outlaws lounged by a broken fence. Their coarse laughter drifted on the wind. The leader, a tattooed brute named Grom Dunn, spat tobacco into the dirt as he sized up the horizon. Marilena squared her shoulders. Her dress, once white as new snow, was now the color of storm cloud stained, torn, but still unwavering in its purpose. She approached the gang with a warrior's poise, her eyes fierce, jaw set in a line of steely determination. "You've come for the widow," Dunn sneered, voice thick with disdain. "She's got nothing left worth tackin'." Marilena smiled, the gesture a blade flashing in the dark. "You're right about that," she replied, voice calm as the grave. "But I'm not what you expected." Even the thugs paused, amused curiosity flickering across hardened faces. Before the first shot rang out, the wind fell still, as if the world itself held its breath. A solitary hoofbeat sounded atop the ridge, measured and deliberate. Marilena took a breath that felt like sunrise. The gun in her grip weighed heavy but true. "Legends don't die in dusty memories," she murmured, more to herself than to them. And at that moment, The prairie shadow returned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Rain came in whispers that night, falling on the charred remains of the Valdez farm and drumming gently on Marilena's shoulders as she trudged toward town. Each drop hissed against still smoldering wood, carrying with it the smell of loss and the promise of cleansing. She did not flinch at the thunder that rolled above. Her storm was inside her now, and it would not be silenced by the sky. She kept her hand pressed to the letter in her pocket, the prairie shadow's vow inked on thin paper already softened by sweat and heat. She'd never met him, never even seen his face, but every whisper said he'd once been the terror of men like Dunn, the reason outlaws checked the shadows before drawing their guns. The sheriff might have written him off as a ghost story, told in saloons, but Marilena carried his legend like armor dot at the edge of town. The muddy road pooled around her boots. She passed shuttered windows and drawn curtains. Few dared to open doors for a widow with trouble at her back. But when she pushed through the doors of the old general store, she found Tomas Ramirez, half drunk, half dreaming, staring at his ledger like it might turn to gold if he blinked enough. Tomas jumped when he saw her, eyes darting to the shotgun under the counter. "Senora Valdez," he stammered. "They say you lost everything." What can I?" Marilena's voice was steady as stone. "A horse, fresh cartridges, and a message sent." Tomas frowned, scratching his unshaven cheek. "Message? To who?" She pulled the letter from her pocket, laid it on the counter like a holy relic. "To him, if he's still out there." Tomas read the signature, just an old sigil, a crude mark that only those who needed it would recognize. His eyes widened. "Senora, you can't be serious. That man, he's a ghost, or worse. If you bring him here, there'll be more blood, more fire. Not if they leave," Marilena said. Her eyes glinted like steel beneath her grief. "But they won't. Men like Dunn never do." She leaned across the counter, close enough for Tomas to smell the smoke still clinging to her hair. "I didn't come for your blessing. Just the horse." Tomas swallowed. In the silence, the rain pattered against the roof, a gentle lullaby over the drumbeat of Marilena's resolve. Finally, with a trembling sigh, he ducked behind the store and returned with a battered saddlebag, a pouch of cartridges, and an old bay gelding tethered at the post out front. "God go with you," Tomas muttered as he handed her the reins. "God's busy tonight," Marilena said. She mounted with surprising grace for a woman 6 months heavy with child. But the shadow? He's coming. Dunn's men made camp on the outskirts, their laughter echoing between blackened trees like hyenas circling a fresh carcass. They'd taken over the McAllister barn, driven the family into the hills, and tied up the young farmhand for sport. A single lantern burned in the hayloft window, its glow dancing across the wet grass where Dunn himself leaned against the corral post, picking his teeth with a splinter. He didn't see her at first. Marilena slid from her horse and let her boots sink in the mud, moving closer like a wraith in the rain. She carried her father's old rifle slung across her back. It felt too big in her hands but right in her heart. When Dunn finally turned, he barked a laugh so sharp it startled the crows nesting above. "Well, look what's crawled from the ashes," he mocked. He tipped his hat back, revealing a face pockmarked by bad whiskey and worse sins. "Mrs. Widow, come to beg?" Marilena looked past him, eyes tracing the outline of the barn. She could hear the farmhand's muffled groans, the raucous snoring. "Off Dunn's boys." Then her gaze settled on Dunn's pistol, resting easy on his hip like an old snake coiled and sleeping. "I came to tell you," she said, her voice calm as the rain. "You should go," Dunn spat into the mud. "Or what?" Behind him, the night seemed to bend. For a heartbeat, the patter of rain on rooftops fell silent. Then a single word rolled from the darkness like thunder across dry plains. "Or me." Done. Spun, hand slapping leather, but the pistol never cleared the holster. A man stepped from the shadows behind the barn, his hat brim low, duster dripping with rain. The prairie shadow. His silhouette was all the stories said it would be, lean as a blade, steady as death. The lantern flickered across the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, the only sign of how close death had come to claiming him once. Dunn's fingers twitched uselessly. His eyes darted to Miralina, her rifle raised now, pointed not at him but at the men inside the barn. "Tell them," she said to Dunn, her voice quiet thunder. "Tell them the wind's changed." Dunn's mouth worked, but no words came. The shadow took a single step closer, the faint click of his hammer the only sound more deafening than the rain. "Go on," the shadow murmured. "Run, the cowards." Choice was written on Dunn's face before he even made it. He turned, barking orders, voice breaking on every word. Inside the barn, boots thudded on old planks, curses echoing. But the shadow never flinched. His gun stayed down by his side, smoke curling from the barrel only after the first man burst through the hayloft door. A single shot. A scream, then chaos. Miralina stood her ground as muzzle flashes bloomed like ghost flowers in the night. She squeezed her trigger once, twice, felt the recoil hammer her shoulder like a mule's kick. The baby inside her twisted, but she did not waver. The shadow moved like a ghost, cutting down shadows with shadows. Men fell into the mud, some crawling, some never rising. Dunn screamed for them to fight, but each order fell flatter than the last echo. When the smoke cleared, the barn stood silent. Only the rain applauded. Dunn dropped to his knees, breath ragged, eyes wide with disbelief. The shadow holstered his iron, boots squelching through the mud as he stepped over bodies in broken pride. "You," Dunn wheezed, voice hoarse with fear. "You were dead." The shadow's eyes, colder than any bullet, locked on his prey. "Legends don't die, Dunn. They wait." Beside him, Miralina lowered her rifle, exhaling a breath that had been trapped for too many lifetimes. The shadow glanced at her, and for the first time, his eyes softened. He nodded once, a silent promise passed from an old ghost to a new mother. But the wind howled through the broken barn, carrying whispers of riders far worse than Dunn and his worthless pack. In the distance, thunder rolled that wasn't thunder at all. Miralina felt it, the tremor that made her heart pound louder than the storm. The prairie shadow turned, his silhouette framed by the glow of the dying lantern. This was only the beginning. Horizon crackled with gunfire, and the night, once quiet, screamed again. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. The storm that night did not fade with dawn. It lingered, like the gun smoke curling around the edges of the Valdez orchard, now a graveyard for the last of Dunn's boys. The prairie shadow stood at the threshold of the burned-out barn, watching Miralina as she wrapped her cloak tighter around her shoulders. Her breath showed in the chill air, mingling with the acrid scent of scorched timber and black powder. He had a name once, this ghost in a gunfighter's coat, Leandro Devereux, though few living souls remembered it. To most, he was the prairie shadow, a name parents whispered to their sons when they bragged too loud in saloons. But to Miralina, standing with the curve of life beneath her heart, he was something more than a legend. He was her final chance at survival. "I never thought you'd come," she said. Her voice trembled, but her spine did not. "They said you'd vanished into the desert, that you'd grown old, soft." The shadow tilted his hat back just enough for her to see the lines on his face, marks of hard years spent hunting ghosts that wore spurs and pistols. His eyes, though, were young. "Cold as the Rio Grande in winter. Soft," he repeated. A bitter smile tugged at his scarred mouth. "Only in dreams." She looked at him then, really looked, his duster torn at the hem, boots scuffed, the revolver holstered low at his hip where his hand rested like a sleeping rattlesnake. For a moment, She saw the shape of the man he'd been before the gunfights, the duels, the murders disguised as justice. "More are coming," he said. He didn't need to say who. She'd seen the tracks herself at first light. Fresh horses, bigger than Dunn's ragged crew, boots polished and spurs clean, professionals, bounty hunters, mercenaries, men who'd trade their own blood for silver. "I don't care who they send," she said. The flames in her orchard had forged something hard inside her chest. "I won't run, not again." The shadow studied her, his gaze flicking to the slight tremor in her hand as she clutched her father's rifle. "You think your husband would want you fighting with a baby in your belly?" Marilina's jaw set. She stepped closer, eyes level with his. "My husband is gone. But my child won't grow up fearing wolves that think they own this land. I'd rather die fighting than live kneeling." For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then, so quiet it could have been the wind through scorched branches, he murmured, "Good." They rode at noon, when the sun broke through the storm clouds, turning the mud roads to rivers of reflected light. Word had spread like fire in dry brush townsfolk, peeking from behind shutters as the widow Valdez and the prairie shadow passed by. Some bowed their heads. Others locked their doors. At the old mission church, Father Alejo waited on the steps, cassock flapping in the wind. He raised his hands in silent benediction as they approached. "Señora Valdez," he said, "and you. I never thought I'd live to see your shadow darken my door again." "Not here for prayers," the shadow said. He swung from his horse with an ease that belied the miles he'd traveled. "You know the land better than any man alive. Tell me where they'll come from." Father Alejo hesitated. He looked at Marilina, saw the hardness in her eyes, and nodded once. 2 days north, there's an old garrison the railroad abandoned after the war. It's where men like this gather close enough to strike, far enough to vanish. They'll move by dusk. They'll want the darkness. Marilina drew in a breath that rattled her ribs. "Then we meet them in the dark." "No," the shadow said. He touched her shoulder, his glove rough with sand and blood. "You stay, you guard what's left." She slapped his hand away. "My child and I have nothing left to guard but the hope you gave us. Don't ask me to bury that hope in these ashes." For the first time, something like respect shone in the prairie shadow's eyes. He nodded. "Then ride with me." Father Alejo raised his crucifix as they turned to leave. "May God go with you both." The shadow mounted, his voice a low promise as they set off toward the horizon. "God's busy tonight, Padre. He's got no business where we're headed." The sun dipped low as they crossed the barren flats north of town, the wind clawing at their cloaks. Marilina's mind drifted to her orchard, now blackened stumps that smoked like funeral pyres. She gripped her rifle tighter. "You ever shot a man before?" The shadow asked without looking at her. She hesitated. "No." "You will tonight. I know." They reached the ridge above the garrison as dusk bled into night. The ruined outpost sprawled like a carcass, picked clean stone walls cracked by years of neglect, the old barracks sagging under the weight of time. But lights flickered within, campfires, laughter, the smell of cheap whiskey and fresh horses. "They're getting drunk," Marilina whispered. "They always do before they bleed," the shadow said. He dismounted, drawing his revolver. In the dim twilight, he looked ageless, an echo of gunfights whispered about in every saloon from El Paso to Santa Fe. He turned to her. "Stay here. Watch the horses." "If I don't come back?" "No," she said. "If you fall, I fall. I won't sit behind waiting for your ghost." Thunder rumbled in the west. He studied her face, found no fear there, only the same grim resolve he'd carried for decades. Finally, he nodded. "Stay close then. And when it starts, don't think, just pull the trigger." They moved like shadows down the slope, boots silent in the sand. Each heartbeat was a countdown to violence. Near the outer wall, a guard leaned back in his chair, humming tunelessly, a bottle resting on his chest. He never heard the knife slide between his ribs. The shadow caught the body before it hit the dirt, lowering it gently. Miralena's eyes widened, her breath shallow. She could taste the iron tang of blood on the wind. Inside, the outlaws laughed around their fire, trading stories of the widow they'd burned out, the ghost they'd smoke out next. They didn't see the figures in the dark. They didn't hear the hammercock. The shadow stepped into the firelight. For a heartbeat, they stared in disbelief, whiskey bottles hanging from limp hands. Then the night exploded in gunfire. Miralena's rifle bucked in her hands. Her first shot went wide, shattering a whiskey jug beside a brute's head. He turned, eyes wide. Just as the second round punched through his throat, the shadow moved like death given shape. Each shot spoke a sentence. Each man who fell never finished his. Miralena fired again and again until her shoulders ached and her ears rang. She saw the prairie shadow fall once to one knee, a bullet tearing through his sleeve. He rose without a sound, smoke wreathing him like a ghost's shroud dot when the echoes faded. The garrison was silent, but for the crackle of flames eating spilled whiskey. Bodies sprawled in the dirt, their shadows dancing in the dying firelight. Miralena stood trembling, the weight of her rifle suddenly immense. She looked at the shadow. He holstered his revolver and met her gaze. "They'll send more," he said simply. "I know. And you'll stand with me?" Miralena nodded, her eyes fierce through the tears that threatened. "To my last breath." The prairie shadow turned to the horizon, where the storm gathered once more. "Then they've picked the wrong widow to burn." The wind rose again, carrying the scent of gunpowder and the promise of war yet to come. They rode back from the garrison under a sky boiling with restless clouds, the wind chasing their horses like a pack of wolves nipping at tired hooves. The garrison lay in ruin behind them, bodies buried shallow in the sand, gunfire scars left behind like warnings etched in stone. Every mile that carried them closer to Whisper Valley seemed to pull the world tighter around Miralena's shoulders. Beside her, the prairie shadow rode silent, blood crusting where a bullet had grazed his arm. He favored that side, but gave no sign of pain, his eyes scanning the scrubland ahead, seeing more in the dark than she could in the daylight. They spoke little. Some truths hung heavier than thunderheads. More would come. Better armed, better paid. Vultures fed on the promise of reward. And Whisper Valley, with its dry wells and stubborn people, would stand between them and their prize, a legend reborn, a widow unbroken. When they crested the final rise and saw the town's flickering lamps, Miralena let out a breath she hadn't known she'd held. In the shelter of the churchyard, Father Alejo waited, lantern swinging from one hand. The old priest's eyes widened when he saw the blood, the torn duster, the look in Miralena's eyes. "They won't stop, will they?" the priest asked, voice cracking. The prairie shadow swung off his horse, boots hitting the frozen ground with a thud that felt final. He turned to Alejo, his voice so low it was almost kind. "No, Padre, not while they think there's a reward." In my head or fear in her heart, Father Alejo crossed himself. "God help us." "He will," Miralena said, sliding from her saddle with care. The child within her seemed to shift, as if reminding her who she was fighting for. "But we'll help ourselves, too." The shadow tipped his hat at the priest, then gestured for Miralena to follow. They stepped into the church, the air inside heavy with old wood and older prayers. By the altar, maps were spread across a table, sketches of the valley, the burned orchard, the narrow trails that twisted through the arroyos like veins. "This was your plan all along," Miralena said, tracing a line on the map with a dirt-smeared finger. "You wanted to draw them here." "I don't want anything," he said. "But they chose this road when they burned your home. Men like Dunn, they're small time. But bigger wolves are sniffing at their ashes now." She met his eyes. They looked impossibly tired, the eyes of a man who'd buried too many names and counted each one before sleep. "And you?" she asked. "Why keep fighting?" A smile twitched at the corner of his mouth, sharp, bitter. "Because I owe a debt. Too many widows. Too many ghosts." Outside, the wind carried a sound that made the priest flinch, the faint echo of hooves. Distant but closing fast. "Riders," Allaho whispered. "Too soon," the shadow murmured. He peered out the stained glass window. In the moonlight, they looked like shadows on horseback, half men, half nightmares. "They're scouts," Marilena said, voice tight. "Testing our walls." The shadow's eyes flicked to the priest. "Wake the men. No drunk in Whisper Valley gets to sleep tonight." Alejo ran, lantern bobbing like a dying star. The prairie shadow turned to Marilena, his hand brushing her arm just above the rifle's sling. "You should stay here." She didn't flinch. "You know I won't." He studied her a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Load every round you have." They stepped back into the night together. Snow had begun to fall in wet, heavy flakes that hissed against the rooftops. Down the main street, men emerged from shacks and lean-tos, shotguns and pistols clutched in shaky hands. Old ranchers with whiskey on their breath, boys who had never seen a fight up close, shopkeepers still wearing aprons over long johns. None looked ready, but all of them stood. The shadow climbed the steps of the old saloon, its sign half burned. Von Dunn's last visit. He stood on the porch, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. The crowd stared up at him, this ghost, this gunfighter their fathers had whispered about when the prairie wind moaned at their doors. "Listen close," he said, his voice cutting through the snow and the hush of fear. "They're coming for me, for her." He tipped his head at Marilena. "They'll take your homes next if you stand aside. They'll burn this town to the dirt." A murmur moved through the men, fear and anger, braided like barbed wire. "But they think we're soft, that we'll run." The shadow's hand hovered over his holster, not yet drawing. "We won't. Tonight we teach them the cost of our blood." He stepped down into the street. "Dig trenches by the well. Barricade the alley behind the church. If they get past me, you make them pay for every inch." A big rancher with a scarred cheek spat into the dirt. "And you, Shadow? You really think you can stop what's coming?" He looked at Marilena, her eyes bright and unflinching. Then he nodded once. "I don't need to stop it. Just slow it down, long enough for the rest of you to remember you're not sheep." The men spread out, voices rough but growing stronger. Hammers banged nails into boards torn from the saloon's porch. Lanterns swung from windows, lighting the frozen street like a stage for the coming slaughter. Marilena stood by the shadow's side, rifle braced against her hip. She could feel the life inside her, moving soft kicks that seemed to echo the heartbeat pounding in her chest. "I should be afraid," she said quietly. He glanced at her. "And are you?" She shook her head. "Not with you here." For a heartbeat, he seemed to look past her to some other night, some other woman whose name lingered on his tongue but never fell. Then he tipped his hat low again, the moment gone. In the distance, the riders came into view, lanterns swinging from saddle horns, 6 men abreast, their coats dusted white by the snow. Their laughter drifted on the wind like the creak of an old gallows rope. The prairie shadow pulled his revolver, spinning the cylinder once. The sound was a clock striking midnight. "Stand ready," he said. Marilena lifted her rifle, the stock pressed to her cheek, breath steady despite the tremor in her limbs. Thunder rolled low in her belly, like the baby kicking back at fate. The lead rider lifted a hand, signaling his men to spread wide. They laughed, oblivious to the shadows waiting behind the barricades, oblivious to the legend who'd come home to bury them all. When the first shot cracked the night open, it wasn't from the riders. It was from the widow, and behind her, the prairie shadow smiled like death itself come calling. Gunfire split the night wide open. The echo of that first shot rolled down the muddy street. rattling windows and pounding in the chests of every soul still standing behind barricades and shuttered doors. In that frozen heartbeat, after Marilena pulled her trigger, the riders flinched, hesitation flashing in their eyes as their lead man tumbled from his saddle, a neat hole where his arrogance used to be. And then hell came loose. The prairie shadow stepped forward, revolver raised, the lamplight catching the dull steel and the cold set of his eyes. He moved like a man walking through rain calm, unhurried, while the world screamed around him. His first shot slammed into the shoulder of a second rider before the man could fully draw, sending him spinning into the snow-churned street. From the alley behind the church, Tomas Ramirez and two ranch hands opened up with shotguns. The blasts were ragged but enough to scatter the mounted men, their horses rearing and snorting steam into the freezing air. Marilena braced her rifle against the barricade, reloading with fingers that felt both numb and burning. Each round she shoved into the chamber felt like an oath, one more promise that her baby would grow up on land not ruled by fear. The shadow was everywhere at once, darting from cover to cover, boots crunching on fresh snow as he fired and reloaded in a single motion. One outlaw made it close enough to swing a rusted saber. The shadow caught the man's wrist mid-swing, drove his revolver up under the man's jaw, and pulled the trigger. Bone and blood misted the snow. A boy no more than 16, skinny as a fence post and shaking like a leaf, crouched behind a barrel with an old six-shooter clutched in both hands. He looked up at the prairie shadow as he passed, wide-eyed, paralyzed. "Point and pull," the shadow barked. "Don't think. Just breathe and pull." The boy swallowed, nodding, his eyes flicking to Marilena as if to draw strength from her. She squeezed off another round at a man trying to flank the barricade, saw him stagger back, clutching his side. Her shoulders throbbed with each shot, but her mind felt clear, sharper than it had ever been tending fields or feeding livestock. This was her harvest now, in the chaos. Father Alejo dragged the wounded back into the churchyard, where lanterns burned in the drifting snow like tiny stars. He pressed cloth to torn flesh, whispered prayers over men who would never see dawn. Blood stained the holy steps, but his hands did not tremble. Through it all, the riders tried to rally, guns barking from the shadows, hooves churning up slush and grit. But they were outmatched by something they hadn't planned for, a town that refused to bow. Behind the makeshift barricade, Tomas shouted orders, his drunk's slur replaced by the bark of a man defending his last fence line. Near the well, two of Dunn's old cronies, who'd slunk back hoping for easy loot, crawled toward cover. The shadow spotted them and fired, his revolver booming in the cold air like a drumbeat of reckoning. One fell. The other tried to run but caught a round in the thigh, pitching him face first into the mud. When the first wave broke, they left behind 6 bodies and 3 wounded crawling for the brush. The wind carried their cries away, along with the smell of burned powder and spent brass. The town exhaled. But the shadow did not. He scanned the darkness beyond the street lamps, eyes narrowed, finger resting on the trigger guard of his Colt. "Reload," he ordered. "All of you, check your barrels. Check your friends, they're not done yet." Marilena lowered her rifle. Her breath came in ragged puffs. She glanced down, one hand pressed to her belly, feeling the baby shift as if restless from the gunfire. A fresh tremor ran through her, not of fear, but of resolve knitting bone back together. "Will they try again tonight?" Tomas asked, voice raw from shouting. The shadow didn't look at him. "If they're smart, they'll wait for the second wave. Regroup, surround us come dawn. And if they're not smart?" The shadow's mouth twitched, though it never quite became a smile. "Then I bury them before the sun finds them." In the lull, Father Alejo approached, his cassock soaked to the knee, hands black with blood not his own. He met the shadow's eyes, that quiet question passing between men who'd seen too much. "How many more?" the priest asked. The shadow answered without hesitation. "All of them." He turned to Marilena then, studying her with the same precision he gave the empty street. Her hair clung to her temples with sweat and melted snow. Her knuckles were white around the rifle stock. "You did well," he said. His voice was quiet, but she heard the weight behind it, the kind of respect that could not be bought with coin or fear. She tilted her chin. "It's not over." "No," he agreed. "But it's begun, and that's the hardest part." Behind them, lanterns swung as townsfolk dragged bodies toward the churchyard. Some worked in silence. Others wept over the men they'd killed, neighbors turned enemies, faces they'd known over cards or cattle trades. In the morning, this place would smell like death and shame and something new, the bitter scent of freedom earned in blood. The shadow stepped away from the barricade, his silhouette tall against the flickering fires. Snow fell on his hat brim, melting where it touched the warmth of his skin. "Go inside," he told Miralina. "Rest, drink water. That baby needs you strong when they come again." She looked like she might argue, but the fight left her shoulders all at once. She leaned the rifle against the fence post, fingers trembling as they slipped from the trigger guard. "Don't let them come close," she said, her voice low but fierce. "I can't bury another piece of my soul." The shadow watched her walk away, the drifted snow swallowing her footsteps. Around him, the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to return. He holstered his Colt, eyes scanning the horizon where dawn threatened to break, a new day that would not come easy. He spoke to the dark, to the ghosts that haunted his every step. "Come and see," he whispered. "Come and see what happens when you leave a widow with nothing left to lose." And the wind carried his promise out across the prairie, where wolves with silver spurs rode to test a legend they thought long dead. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. Dawn broke like a blade across Whisper Valley. Pale sunlight spilled through ragged clouds, throwing long shadows over the muddy street where blood had frozen into dark veins in the earth. The townsfolk emerged one by one, blinking against the light, rifles slung across tired shoulders. They looked older now, worn thin by the night, but held together by something harder than fear. Miralina stood on the church steps, one hand braced against the rail, the other resting on her belly. Her eyes tracked every shape that moved between barricades and rooftops, searching for signs of betrayal or cowardice. But what she saw instead were men and women who refused to bow. Fathers, sons, grandfathers, faces she'd passed for years. Without a second thought, now hardened like iron pulled from the forge, the prairie shadow was already in the street, boots crunching on the frosted ground. He hadn't slept. He didn't look like he needed to. He moved among the barricades, checking rifles, murmuring a word here, a nod there. No grand speeches now, just the quiet, steady presence of a man who'd made peace with killing long ago, and who would stand until his last breath to make sure no child grew up fearing a tyrant's boot. Father Alejo came to Miralina's side, his cassock stiff with dried blood. He followed her gaze to the shadow below. "You're holding up," the priest said softly. Miralina didn't take her eyes off the street. "I'm alive. He's alive. That's enough for now." Alejo gave her a sad smile. "And the child?" "He kicks," she said, pressing her palm closer. "As if he wants to fight too." A rumble drifted on the wind hoofbeats, maybe a mile out, pounding the frozen earth like war drums. The prairie shadow turned, eyes narrowing as he scanned the ridgeline beyond the burned orchard. "They're here," Tomas Ramirez called from the saloon roof. His voice carried across the brittle morning. "Riders. At least 20. Miralina's stomach tightened. 20, more than last night. Better armed, better paid. Father Alejo crossed himself. May God guide their bullets astray. The prairie. Shadow looked up at him. Bullets don't need God. They need eyes that don't blink. He motioned to Miralina. She stepped down the church steps, rifle slung over her shoulder, the morning wind tugging at the hem of her dress. The street. felt impossibly wide-open ground that could swallow the strongest stand whole. "You still have time," he said when she joined him. "I can hold them. You get the townsfolk out through the old cattle trail." She laughed, though there was no joy in it. "Run? And be hunted until I'm nothing but another burned ruin? No, my child will know this land wasn't abandoned by the ones sworn to protect it." His eyes crinkled. Not a smile more like the ghost of what a smile once was, decades ago. "Then stay close. And remember, you're fighting for him." He nodded to her belly. "Not for me." Hoofbeats thundered closer now, resolving into shapes on the far side of the orchard. Men in dusters, rifles strapped across their backs, pistols swinging low. One rode ahead, his horse a beast black as midnight, hooves kicking up frozen dirt. He stood in his stirrups, hand raised. The riders fanned out behind him, forming a loose half-circle around the main road into town. "Whisper. Valley." The lead rider called, his voice echoing off the clapboard facades. "You've got no sheriff left, no law. Give us the gunman. Give us the widow, and maybe we leave your children breathing." Tomas Ramirez spit from the rooftop. "Come take them, you sons of dogs." The lead rider laughed. "Brave words, brave fools." Beside Miralena, the prairie shadow drew his Colt. He sighted down the barrel, steady as an old oak in a prairie wind. "Don't fire until they do," he said to the barricade line behind. Make them think they're safe." The lead rider pulled a folded paper from his coat, waving it like a flag. "This bounty says we can take his head to Carson Hill, dead or alive. You want to die for him?" Someone in the barricade muttered a curse. The shadow's voice cut through the rumble like a blade. "Hold." The riders advanced a few steps. The morning light glinted off spurs and polished steel. One laughed a barking sound that reminded Marilena of Dunn's crew before they bled. Out on her orchard soil, last chance. The lead rider shouted, "Lay down your arms and kneel." The shadow raised his revolver. "No." The rider's mouth twitched in surprise. "No, no," the prairie shadow repeated, calm as winter. "We don't kneel here." For a heartbeat, silence. Then a single shot cracked the morning wide open. Miralena didn't know who fired first, only that the world became flame and thunder, and the screams of horses startled into madness. She dropped to one knee, bracing the rifle across the top of the barricade. Through the chaos, she saw the prairie. Shadow moving like the wind, his revolver spitting death with each squeeze of the trigger. He never stayed still. Every step was a dance older than memory. Sidestep, pivot, fire. A horse reared beside him, its rider pitching backward with a blossom of blood where an eye used to be. The barricade line held barely. Tomas and his ranch hands ducked, fired, reloaded, their breath steaming in the cold. The boy who'd frozen the night before now fired blindly, each shot better than the last, each miss replaced by a hit born of sheer terror. But the riders kept coming. They poured around the edges of the orchard, seeking gaps, kicking indoors. One slipped past a barricade and lunged for Miralena, knife raised. She swung the rifle like a club, the stock smashing his cheekbone, sending teeth into the mud. She fired once, point blank, his eyes wide as glass before he fell. The shadow saw, his jaw tight, but he didn't waver. His revolver barked dry. He holstered it, drew another one she hadn't seen hidden in his coat. The hammer clicked, the barrel smoked. Another rider tumbled from the saddle. Gun smoke rolled like fog. The morning smelled of cordite and snow and blood. Marilena dropped behind the barricade to reload, fingers stiff, mind buzzing with her heartbeat's thunder. When she rose, she saw the lead rider still upright, still screaming orders. The shadow saw him too. Their eyes locked across the ruin of the street. The rider lifted his rifle. The shadow fired first. The bullet struck the rider's chest, throwing him from his horse like a rag doll. Silence fell. broken only by the final hoofbeats of the last outlaw fleeing into the hills. Behind the barricade, a cry went up, a hoarse, ragged sound of men who knew they'd live to see another dawn. Marilena dropped her rifle, breath ragged. She looked at the prairie shadow. He stood still, revolver lowered, smoke drifting from its barrel like incense from a funeral pyre. "It's done?" she asked Dot. He shook his head once. "Not yet." But today they learned. The people of Whisper Valley stepped from the barricades, staring at the bodies that littered their street. In that cold dawn, they understood what it meant to stand together and what it cost. Father Alejo raised his hands to the sky. "May God forgive us all." The shadow holstered his gun, turning to Marilena. His voice was soft. "Go rest now. Your child's earned that." She stared at him, this ghost who bled and killed and bled again for strangers he didn't know a thing. "And you?" He watched the distant hills where more shadows waited to test him. His eyes looked beyond her, beyond the orchard and the town, to some place only he could see. "I'll stand," he said, "until they stop coming." And the wind carried his promise across the valley, over the graves dug in frozen soil, over the houses that would rebuild, over the widow who would not kneel. It carried a warning. The prairie shadow still lived, and he would not rest. By midday, the battlefield that had been Whisper Valley's main street was nothing but churned mud and half-covered bodies waiting for burial. Crows gathered on rooftops, their caws swallowed by the steady hammering of boards and the low hum of prayers drifting from the churchyard. The barricades still stood, patched with fresh lumber and iron nails stripped from abandoned wagons. The smell of gunpowder lingered, but beneath it rose the unmistakable scent of hot stew from a cauldron Tomas Ramirez had set to boil for the exhausted fighters. Marilena sat on the steps of the church, her back pressed to the railing, eyes half shut against the glare of the pale sun. Her arms ached from the fight, her shoulders bruised where the rifle had slammed her again and again. But she didn't feel any of it. Her mind drifted through the soft warmth of the baby shifting inside her, kicking gently at her ribs, reminding her with every flutter why she had not run. Beside her, Father Alejo knelt in the churned soil, marking small wooden crosses for the dead. Each name he spoke sounded like an absolution pulled from the marrow of his bones. Some crosses held two names, fathers and sons felled by the same bullet. "Don't blame yourself," she said quietly, watching him carve one more name into splintered wood. He paused, sweat glistening on his brow despite the cold. "If not me, then who?" "The men who rode in here, thinking they could own our graves," she said. "Blame them." Father Alejo sighed, brushing dirt from his calloused palms. "They won't be the last, Marilena." She looked down the street, where the prairie shadow leaned against the porch post of the old saloon. His hat was pulled low, but she could see the sharp line of his jaw, the way his eyes swept every rooftop, every alley. He looked like a man waiting for the horizon to spit out its next monster. "I know," she said. Inside the saloon, Tomas poured cheap whiskey into battered tin cups. A few ranchers huddled near the stove, their boots caked with blood and mud. They drank in silence, each lost in the fresh ghosts that clung to their shoulders. The shadow stood apart from them, staring at the bullet holes, peppering the back wall. Each scar was a reminder that this place, this nowhere town forgotten by time, had become a crucible that could forge or shatter them all. Tomas approached, offering a cup. The shadow didn't take it. "You're not human," Tomas muttered, forcing a weak grin. "The rest of us need this just to stand." The shadow's eyes flicked to him, cold but not unkind. "I've buried too many good men with whiskey on their breath. I'll keep my head clear." Tomas swallowed, nodding. He leaned closer, voice dropping. "Word is spreading. Riders who fled last night, they'll carry tales about what happened here. Some folks might see that as a good thing." The shadow's mouth twitched into something that almost resembled a smile. "Some will come because they're afraid. More will come because they're not. A gust of wind rattled the saloon's broken shutters. Tomas lowered his voice even further. And her, the widow? You're going to let her stand with you again? The Shadow's eyes shifted toward the door, where sunlight framed Marilena's silhouette as she stepped inside. I don't let her do anything. She's made her choice. Marilena crossed the threshold like a queen entering a ruin, her shoulders squared, chin lifted. The men at the stove fell silent, heads dipping in respect they didn't yet know how to put into words. You need sleep, the Shadow said, his voice low but edged with something gentle. You've done enough for a week of lifetimes. She shook her head. I won't close my eyes while they're still out there. And neither will you. Tomas gave a short, brittle laugh. The whole territory will know by dawn tomorrow, Whisper. Valley stands, and the prairie shadow stands with it. Marilena's eyes cut to Tomas, hard as a hammer on an anvil. No, not just him. We stand with him. There's a difference. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant thrum of hooves. Not close yet, but close enough. The Shadow tilted his head, listening like a wolf catching the scent of a rival pack. More scouts? Tomas asked, his voice gone dry. The Shadow holstered his revolver, the motion so smooth it seemed part of him. Or the next wave. Hard to say until they're close enough to kill. Marilena felt her heart skip. She ran a hand over her belly, calming the small foot that pressed insistently against her ribs. We have hours? The Shadow's eyes flicked to the window, where the sun hovered above the ridgeline like a blade waiting to drop. If we're lucky, he turned to the men by the stove. Gather every able body, patch the barricades, position sentries on the ridge. If they get this far again, we make them drown in their own blood. One of the ranchers, a bearded man named Silas who'd once been a preacher's son, crossed himself and stood. Yes, sir. They filed out, boots thudding across the boards, taking Tomas with them. The saloon fell quiet, just Marilena and the Shadow standing in the dust and the ruin and the promise of more ruin to come. Why did you come back? She asked finally. Why not stay gone? Why carry this fight? The prairie Shadow tilted his head, studying her as if trying to decide how much truth she could bear. Because men like Dunn made widows before you. Because I watched too many good women bury their husbands while the world turned its back. Because every time I put down my gun, the world found a way to put it back in my hand. He stepped closer, voice low enough that only she could hear. Because if I stand alone, they win. But if you stand with me, maybe they learn there are some towns you don't burn. Some widows you don't provoke. Marilena held his gaze, her hand steady on her belly. Then let them come. The Shadow nodded once. They will. Outside, the wind carried the hoofbeats closer, thundering across the plain like an omen. That refused to die. The barricades creaked. Rifles were checked. Fathers kissed the foreheads of sons they might not see again by morning dot in the heart of the saloon. The prairie Shadow and the pregnant widow stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the door where the next ghosts would step through. No banners, no lawmen. Just one battered legend and a woman with everything to lose. And together, they waited for the horizon to test them again. Night returned to Whisper Valley like a thief testing every latch. The sky was thick with rolling clouds, a moonlit bruised black and silver, casting shifting shadows across the churned mud that had been the stage for so many deaths already. The wind carried the tang of blood and burning lamp oil, but beneath it rose something colder, the low, distant whine of riders regrouping in the dark. Inside the old church, Marilena sat in the back pew, eyes half closed as Father Alejo whispered prayers over the makeshift infirmary. Men lay on the stone floor wrapped in blankets that did little to keep out the bite of the wind sneaking through the cracked stained glass. Their groans stitched a rough hymn through the priest's murmured Latin. She pulled her coat tight around her swollen belly, feeling her child shift, restless beneath her ribs. The baby had been calm during the worst of the fighting, as if even in the womb he'd known to hold steady while bullets whined overhead. Now he seemed impatient, as if he could sense the next wave coiling just beyond the hills. Mother of God, Father Alejo breathed. His fingers slipped from the beads of his rosary. How many more must die for one man's past? Marilina's eyes opened, sharp as steel. Not for his past, Padre, for our future. Out in the street, the prairie shadow stalked the barricades like a wolf pacing his den. The snow that had fallen in patches during the day now stuck fast to the earth, hardening into a crust that muffled the steps of the few sentries who kept watch. Each carried a borrowed rifle. Each jumped at every snapping branch or distant crack. Of ice. Tomas Ramirez waited at the well, one hand on the pump handle, the other wrapped around the grip of a revolver that still smelled of cordite from the morning fight. His eyes were red, but the tremble in his hands had vanished, burned away by hours of fear and resolve. "They're out there," Tomas said as the shadow approached. "I can feel it. Like wolves waiting for a weak calf to wander." The shadow crouched, pulling a handful of snow to his lips, tasting it as if it could reveal secrets the wind carried. He spat it out, eyes narrowing toward the ridge. "They'll test the edges first. Look for gaps, try to make us fire early." Tomas shivered. "Then what? Then they come, all teeth, all guns." A noise from the shadows made Tomas jerk. The shadow drew his Colt with the casual grace of a man who'd done it 1,000 times and never missed. But it was only the boy, the same one who'd frozen his first time under fire. He carried a battered shotgun twice too big for him, breath pluming white. "Mr. Shadow, sir," the boy stammered, voice cracking. "I saw figures up past the orchard. 5 or 6, maybe more. Scouts," the shadow said. "Good eyes." He ruffled the boy's hair, a gesture so brief it almost didn't exist, and motioned him back to cover. The boy's eyes gleamed like a pup's learning how to bare his teeth. Marilena stepped from the church into the brittle cold, rifle braced across her back. She found the prairie shadow standing by the old wagon they'd turned into munitions. Stockpile boxes of cartridges, half-empty whiskey bottles stuffed with oil-soaked rags. "You'll light them?" she asked, nodding at the makeshift bombs. "If they push us to the last door," he said. "One good fire in the street might buy us enough time to get the women and wounded out the back." Marilena set her palm to her belly, feeling another small kick. "We won't run." His eyes met hers, that flinty blue that seemed older than the land itself. "No, but if you have to, you will, for him." She didn't argue, didn't promise. Just loaded a fresh round into the battered Winchester her father had given her the day she married Juan Valdez. That rifle had guarded their orchard, their home, and now it would guard what remained of her dreams. The shadow watched her movements, calm, precise. She had learned fast. Fear had no place left in her. Only the fierce light of something primal, a mother's wrath, a widow's promise. "Word is, they're led by a new man now," Tomas said, joining them. He held up a scrap of paper, torn from the bounty posters that had started to litter the territory. The face was smudged, but the name burned. Red Jack. "Bellamy," Marilena read it aloud, her voice flat. "Another Jack." The shadow's jaw tightened. Not like Dunn. Dunn was a rattlesnake that rattled loud so you'd see him coming. Bellamy's worse. Smiles when he cuts your throat. Rides with hired men who think the world owes them something. Tomas looked from one to the other. "They say he was yours once." The shadow didn't blink. "A long time ago." Marilena's fingers found the cold stock of her rifle. "Doesn't matter who he was, only what he is now." From the ridge came a crack like a branch snapping under a careless boot. All 3 heads turned. Sentries shifted, rifles raised. The wind fell dead still. Even the crows huddled on the bay. Rooftops seemed to hold their breath. "Positions," the shadow said. He spoke it softly, but it rolled down the street like the sound of a hammer cocking back. Tomas limped off toward the well. The boys scrambled up to the saloon roof, shotgun clutched in hands that no longer shook. Father Alijo stepped from the church, sleeves rolled high, bandages draped over one arm like a battlefield priest from a painting come to life. Miralina moved to the barricade. The boards slick beneath her palm. The baby inside her gave one last kick, strong and steady. They picked the wrong farm to burn. She whispered to the night. Beside her, the prairie shadow drew his revolver. In the lamplight, his scar looked deeper, the line of it a reminder that ghosts can bleed, but they do not die easy. When Red Jack Bellamy and his men stepped into the lantern's glow, they came slow like wolves, certain the sheep would not bite. But Whisper Valley was done being sheep. The shadow's voice cut the air. One chance, Jack. Take your men. Ride west. Never come back. Bellamy's grin split his face wide. You think you're still the boogeyman, old friend? I came to put you in the ground. Miralina lifted her rifle, eyes like cold iron. You'll find out what grows in that ground when you water it with your blood. Bellamy's grin flickered, just for a breath. Somewhere far off, thunder rumbled. But it was only the echo of the war that would come before dawn. Miralina's finger brushed the trigger, and beside her, the prairie shadow smiled, that terrible smile that had made men drop their guns and pray for daylight. The standoff stretched under a sky so dark it felt like the stars themselves were holding their breath. Snow drifted down in lazy flakes, hissing as it touched the barrels of guns leveled across the barricade. Red Jack Bellamy sat his black horse. Easy, the beast stamping frost into the muddy street. His smile was all teeth and lies. Between the widow and the shadow, the air felt brittle, like it might shatter with a single wrong word. Well, Bellamy drawled, flicking ash from the cigarette. Clamped between his teeth, this here's a sight, ain't it? Prairie shadow hiding behind a woman, heavy with child. What would the old stories say about that? The shadow said nothing. He stood just ahead of Miralina, his boots planted where the churned mud met the snow. His eyes never left Bellamy's, even as his hand rested against the Colt on his hip, steady as an oak root. Older than any ghost Bellamy could conjure, Miralina's voice cut the hush. They'd say it took a woman to finish what so-called legends were too tired to finish themselves. A murmur ran through Bellamy's men, rough laughter that didn't reach their eyes. These were killers, not brawlers, wolves grown lean and hungry. They'd circled dying towns before, but none had ever bared its teeth like Whisper Valley. Bellamy leaned forward in the saddle, eyes glinting like a snake's in lantern glow. Tell you what, Shadow. You step aside, hand her over. Hand yourself over, and maybe I let these dirt farmers keep their roofs. The shadow cocked his head, a whisper of a grin pulling at the scar along his jaw. Same promise you made to those families back at Big Hollow or Pine Gulch? Bellamy's grin vanished like smoke on the wind. Different times. Different men. Same grave, the shadow said, his voice flat as the plains. He shifted his stance, boots crunching frost. Last chance, Jack. Take your dogs and run. Bellamy spit into the snow. And let the bounty slip through my fingers? I don't think so. He raised a hand, and the circle of riders behind him tightened, their spurs glinting like fangs. Miralina felt the old fear rise in her throat, then pressed it down like iron hammered cold. Her father's rifle nestled into her shoulder as natural as her own heartbeat now. You men know what waits for you here. She called out, voice ringing clear over the wind. You think you're coming for coin, but you're riding into your own graves. A young outlaw, no more than 20, shifted in his saddle, eyes flicking to Bellamy. Doubt bloomed like frostbite. Bellamy saw it too. His voice cracked like a whip. Anyone wavers, they'll answer to me. We ride through this town tonight and leave nothing but ashes. A hiss of boots on ice. Father Alejo, standing just behind the barricade, his crucifix raised high in the lantern glow. "Turn back," he said, voice low but carrying, "or the ground you feed will refuse to. Hold your bones." Bellamy barked a laugh. "Preacher, you best start praying for this whore and her ghost." Marilena didn't flinch. She felt her baby roll inside her, warm and fierce. She pressed her cheek to the rifle stock, breath fogging the wood. The shadow spoke so soft only. She could hear. "You don't have to do this." "Yes," she said. "I do." Bellamy lifted his hand signal for the wolves to close in. Hooves clopped through the snow, the line tightening. Steel glinted. A match flared as one of Bellamy's. Men lit a fuse on a bottle of lamp oil. Marilena's world narrowed to the bee at the end of her barrel, the rise and fall of her breath. The prairie shadow's silhouette stood just ahead of her, the legend that was, and the man who remained. "Now," the shadow said. Her finger squeezed the trigger. The first shot split the world in two, the lantern beside. Bellamy's lead man exploded, spraying fire across his coat. He howled, rolling from the saddle, and the chaos broke like a dam. Gunfire roared through the night, echoes bouncing from rooftops as the barricades erupted in muzzle flashes. The shadow moved like a phantom. Each shot a promise kept, each bullet a name whispered to the dead who'd begged him for justice. He dropped one rider who thought to circle wide, then another who tried to slip through the alley by the church. Marilena's shoulders screamed from the recoil, but her mind was diamond clear. She saw the flash of a gun behind a feed wagon fired. Watched the man crumple. Her next round found a rider trying to grab Thomas from behind the barricade. Somewhere, Father Alejo dragged a wounded boy from the street, shouting over the roar of the rifles. He pressed cloth to a chest wound, his prayers drowned in the thunder of the fight. Bellamy dismounted in the chaos, slipping through the shadows, gun drawn low. He ducked behind a half-toppled wagon, eyes locked on the shadow's back. He raised his pistol, grin curling like a hook. The prairie shadow turned two slow gun empty. Hammer clicking dry dot. It was Marilena who saw Bellamy's muzzle flare. She didn't think. She dropped her empty rifle, drew the small revolver Tomas had slipped into her coat. Her hand shook, but not her will. She fired once, twice. The second shot hit Bellamy's shoulder. His gun dropped to the dirt. His scream cut the night like a blade. The shadow lunged, closing the distance in 2 strides. His fist cracked across Bellamy's jaw, sending him sprawling in the snow. He grabbed the outlaw's collar, dragged him up so their eyes met old. Friends turned into death's mirror. "You could have ridden," the shadow hissed. "You could have lived." Bellamy spat blood and laughed. "So could you." The shadow's revolver pressed to Bellamy's chest. The hammer fell. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of snow landing on fresh blood. The last of Bellamy's men scattered, their hoofbeats fading into the dark like a prayer no one believed. Around them, Whisper Valley exhaled. Tomas crawled from behind the barricade, eyes wide as he watched Marilena lower the smoking revolver. The prairie shadow turned to her, chest heaving, eyes sharp but softer than they'd ever been. "You saved me." She stepped forward, gun still trembling in her grip. "We saved each other." From the church, Father Alejo's voice rose over the wounded and the dying. "Let this be the last blood Whisper Valley spills for the sins of men." But the prairie shadow's eyes drifted to the hills, where more storms could always gather. And Marilena, with her child warm and fierce within her, knew they would be ready when they did. Looks great. This part works well with the story's pacing. No changes needed. If you'd like, I can continue with part 13 now to pick up right from this moment, pushing the second wave straight into the showdown. Just confirm if you want. Meet her right part 13, and I'll deliver it in full length with the same immersive tone, tension, and dramatic style. The morning after the blood-soaked street felt eerily placid. Whisper Valley awoke wrapped in an uneasy calm, the air still tinged with the iron scent of last night's violence. Snow remnant clung to shattered boards and frozen drifts, but the deepest chill ran through the hearts of those who had survived. Behind boarded windows, children pressed trembling palms to glass, watching the battered street as if expecting ghosts to rise from the bullet-scarred road. In the fading dawn, a rumble of wheels approached from the east. The stagecoach, its paint chipped and wheels groaning under a heavy load, rattled past the orchard where bodies lay buried in shallow graves. It rolled up to the saloon's splintered porch, stopping with a shudder that echoed like distant thunder. The townsfolk, drawn by curiosity and apprehension, gathered in silent clusters along the boardwalk. From the coach stepped a tall man in a black frock coat, his coattails swaying like dark wings. His face was clean-shaven, pale as the valley's frost, and his eyes held the sharp cold of a steel trap. Behind him followed two deputies, each armed and vigilant. The man removed his wide-brimmed hat, revealing graying hair brushed back from a high forehead. He carried a leather satchel and a heavy book bound in cracked leather. "Good people of Whisper Valley," his voice rang clear, devoid of sympathy, yet not without authority. "I am Judge Silas Harlow, appointed by the Territorial Court. I bring official notice regarding the status of Leandro Devereux, better known by rumor as the Prairie Shadow." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle like dust. Territorial authorities still consider him a wanted man, dead or alive, with a $5,000 bounty on his head. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. $5,000. Enough to fund a fortune for any who dared come hunting. Marilena stood at the edge of the crowd. Marilena's hand brushed her belly, feeling the soft stir of life within. The baby's fluttering seemed louder now, as if sensing the judge's edict, a heartbeat echoing the town's wavering faith. Judge Harlow surveyed the battered saloon before meeting the widow's eyes across the growing assembly. "I offer you a choice," he proclaimed. "Surrender the outlaw known as the Prairie Shadow within 24 hours, and Whisper Valley may retain its territorial charter. Decline, and the court will send a company of rangers to enforce the law, rangers who answer to no town council and accept no mercy." Murmurs rose, tense and conflicted. Tomas Ramirez spat into the mud. "After what he did for us." Father Alejo crossed himself softly. "Judge, he saved us all." The judge tilted his head. "The law has no appetite for gratitude. It demands justice." A young rancher, bleeding from the shoulder since the siege, stepped forward. "What justice can you offer our town after it bled for a lesson you never taught?" Judge Harlow's lips thinned. "I offer the preservation of peace. Turn him in, and the law spares your homes and families the consequences of harboring a wanted man." Silence reigned, heavier than the storm clouds above. Every face in the crowd wore the same question: shield the man who delivered them, or bow to the law that claimed vengeance. In the distance, atop the ridge, a horn sounded once low and resounding. The judge stiffened, glancing toward the north. A second horn answered, deeper and more urgent. Across the horizon, a column of riders crested the hill 20 strong, mounted on bay and dun horses, each man carrying rifles strapped across leather vests and revolvers at their hips. Their coats were the color of fresh blood on snow, their faces set with focus and malice. Bellamy's banner no longer flew, but their presence meant the bounty hunters and mercenaries had come at last. Judge Harlow cleared his throat, stepping back as the riders advanced, boots drumbeating across the thawing earth. Marilena's heart thundered. She felt her child stir, each movement a reminder of what she fought for, not just a choice between law and mercy, but a future for the life she carried. The judge dropped his eyes to the satchel at his feet, his hand hovering over the leather strap. He swallowed hard, torn between duty and the plea forming in the widow's gaze. Behind her, the Prairie Shadow emerged from the saloon's doorway, revolver in hand, coat stained dark at the hem. He faced the riders like a lone tree, defying the Wind's fury, his stance calm, resolute. The traveling judge lifted his head, meeting the shadow's gaze across the cold expanse. The weight of the bounty, the promise of law, and the thunder of approaching mercenaries converged in that silent moment. Marilena stepped forward, voice steady but charged with every fiber of her being. "You've hunted him long enough," she called out. "Turn back now, and you'll regret the blood you shed here." The riders paused, fists tightening on reins. Judge Harlow's hand twitched at the SATCHEL. Then, from beyond the first ranks, a rider drew a saber, shining in the pale light. The blade glinted with intent. A shot rang out sharp, unexpected from the judge's revolver, kicking up snow at the feet of the approaching line. Chaos ignited once more, but this time the battlefield would be darker than before. Mercy and justice had collided, and the cost would fall on every soul in Whisper Valley. Whispers spread through the crowd. Who would stand with the shadow? Who would side with the law? And who would vanish when the true price of hope came due? The judges. Bullets spun his horse sideways. Those mercenaries wavered. But the banner behind them rose a black skull on crimson field, and they advanced again, hooves pounding like war drums. Marilena's hand clenched at her belly, her heart colliding with fate. The choices of a town hung in the balance, and the future of a child trembled in the icy air. The second wave bore down upon them, and in the hush before the storm, Whisper Valley learned how thin the line between salvation and sacrifice could be. Before the sun could crown the saloon's battered sign, a new tension wound tighter than the gale that blasted across the prairie. Silent but for the faint rasp of spurs on the lane, Judge Silas Harlow's deputies fanned out, rifles trained on every face pressed against the frost-bitten boards. Behind them, a mercenary company, half-armored and all hungry for the shadow's head, surveyed the scene with predatory eyes. Marilena Valdez stood in the shadow of the silver-starred facade, her father's Winchester cradled against her hip, her will forged in the crucible of every gunfight fought before dawn. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the baby's heart like a second drumbeat in the hush. Around her, the townsfolk, scarred survivors and fresh recruits, alike tensed as if they, too, felt the unborn child's promise of life beyond smoke and steel. Judge Harlow addressed the silent crowd. His voice, crystalline in its steeliness, rang off the crooked windows and shattered lights. "Citizens of Whisper Valley, you have until the count of 20 to decide. Do you surrender Leandro Devereux, the prairie shadow, or face the wrath of territorial law?" Without waiting for a reply, he pressed a pistol into the hand of the nearest deputy. One bullet for his surrender, one for demonstration. The deputy's gaze flickered to the shadow, who stood just beside Marilena, his duster lined with yesterday's blood and today's resolve. The judge's words floated in the frozen air like gunmetal rain. Marilena stepped forward until she stood at the shadow's elbow. "You've given us protection long enough," she said, voice unwavering. "Time we return the favor." She raised her Winchester, sliding it into the deputy's other hand. The judge's eyebrows climbed a flicker of surprise that perhaps mercy might come in a form he hadn't accounted for. "They fight for each other." "Judge," Father Alejo said, stepping from behind the barricades, crucifix in hand. His voice, weary yet unbending, carried a new authority. "Are you sitting with the law, or are you here to murder hope?" A hush fell. The deputies shifted, unsettled as horses sensing a storm's eye. The mercenaries tightened their grip on rifle butts, exchanged glances that danced between greed and caution. Judge Harlow's jaw clenched. He turned to the mercenaries, silent invitation painted across his brow. Their captain, a tall man with a jagged scar across his left cheek, nodded curtly. "Line up," the captain ordered, voice baritone and unflinching. 12 rifles rose in unison, trained on the gathering townspeople, as a formation of bullets ready to rain death. The shadow didn't blink. He crossed the street in 3 long strides, moving faster than even the judge could follow with his eyes. He stopped within arm's reach of the munitions pile, fingers flicking toward the ramshackle dynamite cache. Marilena had prepared for this moment. Marilena caught his eye, no words needed. With a nod, he placed one hand on her shoulder, the other resting on the cord that would light the prairie sky in fire. Up on the church steps, Luke Heron, the boy who'd taken up arms in the first siege, raised a battered rifle and fired not once but in a burst that rang through the cold. The mercenaries plunged to one knee, reeling from the astonishment of a boy's aim. In that flicker of hesitation, the shadow seized Judge Harlow's satchel, yanking it free. "Law's just ink on paper," he roared. "Here's the true price of blood." He flung the satchel toward the dynamite, the leather bursting open to reveal stacks of greenback bills that fluttered across the snow like wounded birds. The crowd gasped as the cord sparked, oil-soaked rags igniting in a slow fuse. That hissed its last promise. "Run!" Marilena shouted, her voice carrying over the widening gap between defiance and disaster. She grabbed Father Alejo's arm and dragged him out of the blast radius, her heart pounding with the baby's frantic kicks. A roar followed. The explosion inverted the sky, hurling wood and stone into the early light. Dust and smoke billowed. In a calm that rose like judgment, the earth rattled, crows scattered, and the mercenaries stumbled back, stricken by the fury they'd let loose. In the chaos, the shadow hoisted the judge from the snow, revolver in hand. The judge's pistols lay buried in the blast's crater. The mercenaries, disoriented and bleeding stings of hot fragments, could barely breathe, let alone follow orders. The widow took the shadow's hand, clutching it tight. They surrendered. She yelled above the roaring debris, "Turn in your weapons or share the grave we just dug." One by one, rifles dropped to snow, heavy as regrets. The mercenary captain remained last, staring at the crater, at the bodies half buried in fresh snow, at the blood on his boots, and at the single jackpot bundle of currency buried in the crater's heart. He spat, wiped blood from his chin, and then stumbled forward, dropping his rifle. "God help me," he muttered. Silence followed the gun needle thunder, and in that trembling hush, Whisper Valley found its answer. The law lay dead in its own bullet storm. The mercenaries knelt in the dust, unarmed by coercion and awe. Marilena felt the baby hammer her insides, and she pressed her palm to her belly, tears freezing on her lashes. The shadow crouched beside the judge, ripping off his badge and shoving it into the judge's hand. "Tell your masters," he said, voice low and terrible as rolling thunder. "We decide our own fate here." He stood, brushing ash from his coat. The townsfolk gathered around, faces pale but fierce. The mercenary captain finally lifted his gaze, eyes meeting the shadows in a crucible of respect and dread. Then, as if waking from a nightmare, the captain nodded once. "Aye," he whispered, "you've earned the right." A clatter of dropped gear followed as the mercenaries mounted their horses, and Judge Harlow, badge in hand, collapsed to one knee. The snow melted under the heat of Whisper Valleys. Defiance. As the riders disappeared over the ridge, the widow and the shadow walked side by side to the church, where dawn's fragile light illuminated the work of burial and rebuilding. In her arms, the judge's badge looked like a relic of a world they'd fought to leave behind. Marilena turned to her companion, heart soaring with relief and hope. "We did it," she breathed. The shadow paused at the church door, hat in hand, his eyes sweeping the valley one final time. "For tonight," he added quietly, "we have earned tomorrow." But somewhere in the hills beyond, a lone rider paused, catching the dust of their passage. The faint glint of spurs and the whisper of hooves spoke of debts unpaid and legends yet to die. And in the hush before the world fully woke, Whisper Valley learned that peace was no gift, it was a hard-fought breath held between storms, a promise as fragile as a newborn's cry. Night had fallen again over Whisper Valley, but this darkness bore no comfort. The air was taut with anticipation, like the taut string of an arrow aimed at a distant target. The survivors gathered behind the hastily repaired barricades, their faces illuminated by lantern glow and the glimmer of resolve that refused to die. Marilena Valdez stood at the center of the barricade, her hand resting lightly on her father's Winchester, eyes fixed on the ridge where the second wave would emerge. Each breath she took felt like a promise she made to the child within her, breath she wouldn't waste on fear. Beside her, the man once known as the Prairie Shadow, Leandro Devereux, watched the horizon with a steely calm. His scar glinted in the lantern light, a silver slash that bore witness to the price of legend. He wore the widow's sash, her blanket draped over his shoulder, as a sign that this fight belonged to them both. Father Alejo knelt at Marilena's side, clutching a battered crucifix in one hand, a blood-stained kerchief in the other. His prayers were whispered but no less potent, petitions for mercy, pleas for courage, and a vow that the town would stand for every soul it sheltered. Doc Tomas Ramirez moved through the ranks, offering water to the wounded and tightening belts for those who shook with anticipation. Even Luke Heron, the boy who had fired the first shot in Village's defense, steadied his shotgun with a newfound confidence that spoke of bloody lessons learned. The wind shifted, carrying the faint but unmistakable thunder of hooves. Though the night veiled them still, their approach was certain, the rails of dark shapes riding low against the ridge. The second wave, led by the dread specter of Red Jack Bellamy's vengeful banner, this time bearing the colors of those who answered the call to claim the legendary bounty. Marilena's voice cut the hush, firm and clear. Hold steady. Watch the slopes. They'll try to flank the east barricade first. She raised her hand and pointed to the fence near the old mill, its boards cracked but still upright. Luke, you take that position. Aim for their horses. Without mounts, they lose more than ground. Luke nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, ma'am. The horses' hoofbeats grew louder, a rolling symphony of impending violence. Figures now appeared, 7 riders to the east, moving with disciplined silence as if ghosts summoned from the dust. Leandro Devereux raised his revolver just enough for a signal. On my mark, he whispered to Marilena. She nodded, fingers tight around the trigger of her rifle, heart tuned to the rhythm of the coming storm. A faint whistle split the air, an unseen scout signaling the moment. The deer-eyed tension in the valley snapped like a BOWSDR. I'm G. Leandro fired first, one shot that rang out like a verdict. His bullet found the lead scout's shoulder, sending the man sprawling. Chaos exploded along the ridge as lanterns lit the way to rebellion. Marilena followed with 2 precise rounds. Her first found a rider's forearm mid-draw. The second shattered the barrel of a rifle, metal spiraling like sparks of defiance. Horse and rider crashed together in a spasm of panic. From the east barricade, Luke's shotgun roared, tearing at muscles and sinew until horses bucked wild and men tumbled into the snow. Tomas and 3 ranchers joined him, their barrels spewing death into the dark before reloading in practiced unison. But the attackers pressed on, hardened gunslingers who refused to die quietly. They circled westward, shifting their attack toward the churchyard barricade, where Father Alejo and 3 volunteers waited with shotguns pressed to the rails. Hold them here. Devereux called to Marilena, then vaulted over the barricade, moving like a shadow into the fray. His colt barked twice, each shot dropping a rider too close to the church steps. Marilena's world narrowed to the crosshairs of her rifle. She saw the rider with the jagged scar, the mercenary captain who had knelt at her mercy. He advanced, now face hardened into resolve, rifle leveled at Leandro's flickering silhouette. Tomas dropped a lantern into the snow, forging a wall of firelight that fractured the captain's aim. The mercenary cursed, jerked the rifle skyward to readjust, and that moment cost him. Marilena's bullet caught him in the chest, spinning him from his horse like a splinter in the wind. As he lay gasping, Father Alejo and the volunteers surged forward, driving the remainder of the squad back toward the ridge. The churchyard barricade held. Through the broken windows of the church, Miralina saw the wounded huddled beneath the altar, Father Alejo's prayers rising like incense over the fallen. On the main street, Leandro Devereux rejoined her, blood staining his shirt where a bullet had grazed his left shoulder. But he bore no sign of weakening, only the eternal calm of a storm that had already broken. "Another wave comes," he said, voice low and steady. "Riders from the south, faster guns. They know what's at stake." Miralina pressed her cheek against the stock of her rifle, feeling the ache in her bones. "We won't back down." He gave her a crooked nod, then turned his gaze to the southern ridge, where faint glimmers of lantern light danced on leather and steel dot. The wind carried the hoofbeats, closer than before. More than 10 riders now, a final contingent sent by. Some unseen puppeteer eager to watch the legend die. Miralina felt her child kick again, strong and insistent, as if the new life within her demanded to be part of this final stand. Leandro's hand found hers. Fingers curled tight around her glove. "Together, together," she echoed. And in that moment, amidst the gun smoke and the ruined boards and the prayers of the blessed and the damned, Whisper Valley's defenders braced for the showdown that would decide their fate. One last ride into the darkness, one last shout against the night. Before dawn broke, they would forge the story that would outlive every bullet and every legend. The moon dipped low beneath ragged clouds as the final wave rolled in from the southern pass. Its riders no longer hidden phantoms, but confident killers riding tall in silent ranks. Whisper Valley's last defenders tensed at the barricades. Rifles raised, breath misting in the cold air like ghosts refusing to fade. Miralina Valdez felt every beat of her heart echo the pounding of hooves on the frozen ground. Her father's Winchester was an extension of her arms now, her will forged steel-hard by every sacrifice. The life within her stirred with wild energy, as if the unborn child understood the moment's gravity. This fight would decide not just 6 months of dreams, but generations yet unborn. Leandro Devereux stood at her side, the widow's sash draped across his chest, his scar lit by the flicker of lanterns strung along the barricade. His blood ran cold with determination. His breath came easy, a testament to countless battles fought where legends and men collide. Beside them, Luke Heron steadied the makeshift cannon he and Tomas had assembled from salvaged iron and cordite, its muzzle aimed low at the approaching ranks. Father Alejo held a lantern high, his whispered prayers a steady hymn beneath the mounting tension. The first rider to glimpse the barricades hesitated, shadowed form cresting the ridge. His eyes widened at the sight of a town refusing to die barrels. Chained to posts, rifles poised like iron spears, and a legend reborn in a pregnant widow's arms. Miralina raised her voice, clear and unwavering above the hush. "Tonight, we stand for every story whispered around dying campfires. For every widow whose tears burn like brandy on her tongue. For every child who will not wander the prairie afraid." A ripple of resolve swept through the defenders. Tomas Ramirez's voice roared, "For Whisper Valley." And Luke's cannon answered with earth-shaking rumble, the blast tearing into the center of the column. Horses reared, men fell, and the charge stalled. Leandro's revolver barked twice. Each shot a vow. One caught a rider's shoulder, the other spun a horse into the snow. He moved among the fallen, a silent reaper in duster and sash. The survivors pressed forward, rifles cracking like thunder. Barrage met onslaught in a storm of lead and splintered wood. Miralina squeezed her trigger again and again, the recoil a punishment she welcomed. Each shot a story of vengeance that did not demand her soul. From the flank, Bellany's old banner now held by a new standard-bearer spat flame as a throne. Torch ignited barrels of oil. The barricade glowed as if lit by hell's own fire, illuminating faces etched with resolve and fear. Father Alejo stepped forward into the blaze, raising his crucifix high. "Hold!" he cried, voice booming. "This night belongs to the innocent, not the dead." That single word carried like a thunderclap. The attackers faltered, their hatred momentarily shattered by the priest's stand. Leandro seized the moment. With Miralina covering him, he sprinted into the flickering firelight, Colt in hand. The mercenary Captain Scar, raised in challenge, met him at the barricade's edge. They slashed and fired in a lightning dance of steel and lead, each movement honed by years of blood-learned precision. Miralina watched through the flame, breath caught as Colt's steel flashed. Then, in a heartbeat, Leandro's revolver barked. Once, and the captain crumpled, saber dropping from lifeless fingers. The fallen banners slackened. The remaining riders, leaderless and broken, traded uncertain glances, then turned their horses, hoofbeats echoing retreat up the pass. Silence fell abruptly, broken only by the roar of the dying fires and the soft sobs of relief. Miralina sank. To her knees in the swirling ash, tears streaming down frozen cheeks. She cradled her belly, feeling the baby's rapid heartbeat, a life born into violence yet cradled by hope. Leandro knelt beside her, coat singed, breath ragged, eyes alight with fierce triumph. He brushed a curl from her face and bowed his head. "The storm has passed," he whispered, "at least for tonight." Father Alejo emerged from the smoke, offering a flask of whiskey. Miralina drank, warmth flooding her veins. "All of you," Leandro called to the assembled townsfolk, "you stood when the world told you to crumble. You bled so your children could walk unafraid. This night will live in every heart beyond these walls." A cheer rose, hesitant at first, then strong, defiant, the first dawn song of a town reborn. In the aftermath, as whispers of rebuilding rose, Miralina felt a gentle kick inside her, a promise that from this night, life would grow where death once reigned. She looked to Leandro, who lowered his hat respectfully. "We survived," she said. He nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "And so will our children." Above them, the storm clouds parted to reveal a single star gleaming through the haze, a sentinel for the proud souls who chose to stand. Dawn's first light crept over Whisper Valley, revealing a town reborn from ashes, splintered boards, and frozen blood. The battered saloon stood crooked but unbowed, its sign half charred. The silver stars gleamed dulled but recognizable, a testament to resilience over ruin. Bodies had been claimed by the earth last night. Shallow graves around the orchard bore simple wooden markers, each inscribed with a name and a prayer. Miralina Valdez stood on the porch of the saloon, the morning chill pressing against her cheeks. Like a confidant's hand, she cradled her belly, feeling the steady heartbeat of her child, a promise of life that had outlasted every bullet and every vow of vengeance. Smoke still curled from a few burned-out barricades, but already the townsfolk were at work. Tomas Ramirez and Luke Heron pitched a new fence around the orchard, salvaging scorched wood to rebuild protective walls. Father Alejo tended the wounded in the churchyard, his ministrations a blend of prayer and pragmatic skill that stopped bleeding and restored hope. Ranchers and shopkeepers cleared broken wagons from the street, stacking debris to pave paths for travel-worn travelers. Once more, Leandro Devereux emerged from the saloon, his coat cleaned of the worst of last night's blood. The sash Miralina had lent him hung at his side, its white fabric now speckled with ash, a badge of survival. He approached her silently, as if the world held its breath for their reunion. Miralina's lips curved in a soft smile. "Morning." He tipped his hat, the gesture both gentlemanly and weary. "Morning, how are you feeling?" "Like hope made flesh," she replied, her hand brushing his forearm. "But tired." He offered his arm, and she linked hers through his, leaning on his strength for the walk down the boardwalk. They stopped by the oak tree where Juan Valdez had planted each summer, the the bark scarred but alive with sap running beneath. Leandro plucked a single leaf that clung to a distant branch, green and defiant. "It's not over," he said quietly. "The territory's bound to send more for the bounty, for the legend. They'll want to test the mettle of Whisper Valley, now that they know what we're made of." Miralina traced the leaf's veins with a fingertip. "Then we rebuild stronger. We teach them that a town's heart beats in its people, not its guns." He watched her, admiration in his eyes that spoke of 1,000 untold stories. "You've changed me," he admitted. "I came here a ghost-hunting rage. Now I'm a man who believes in tomorrow." She met his gaze, her smile warming the winter air. "And you've changed me. I thought a widow's path ended with ashes. You've shown me it starts with choice." A distant roar drifted on the wind, a freight train's whistle, or thunder rolling down the ravine. Their heads snapped toward the horizon where the railroad tracks cut through the prairie like a promise of connection. Leandro's jaw tightened. "The train," Miralina nodded. "They bring news. Supplies, passengers, possibly more threats." Already, horses neighed beyond the fence, carrying riders in town dusters and broad hats. From the depot, voices called out orders as crates were unloaded. Ammunition, food, medical supplies dotted the crowd. A stranger stepped forward tall, with a rifle slung across his back and a face lined by desert sun and plains wind. He watched Miralina and Leandro with an intensity that betrayed curiosity mingled with caution. Miralina recognized the veteran stance of a man who'd fought hard to stay alive. She offered a nod, and he returned it slowly, as if weighing whether this town belonged on his map of havens or hells. The train's conductor, a round-faced man with a brass badge, called out, "All aboard for Carson Hill. Next departure at noon." He tipped his cap to the frontier gathering, then vanished back into the depot's shadows. Leandro took a step toward the stranger, voice steady. "Welcome to Whisper Valley. Name's Devereaux, some call me the Prairie Shadow." The man's eyes flicked to Miralina's belly, then back to Leandro's scar. "Name's Walker, Jefferson Walker. I heard there'd be a fight worth more than coin out here." Miralina folded her arms, curiosity sparking. "You came looking for work? Justice or storms?" Walker's grin held no shame. "All three maybe, but mostly answers. I heard the Blackwood gang burned a farm. A widow stood her ground. Then a legend came down from the mountains and taught a lesson or two." Leandro's jaw flexed. "Stories grow in the telling," Walker nodded. "But I saw it. We all saw it. Whisper Valley's name travels fast." He glanced at the tracks. "Trains stopping. Carson Hill's a day west. If you need real justice or find ghosts don't die easy, that's where the law lies." Miralina's eyes darkened. "We have our own law now," Walker shrugged. "Still, sometimes you gotta ride to the roots to lift a town from ruin. If you ever need a hand chasing the horizon instead of hiding behind a bar, you know where to find me." Leandro exchanged a look with Miralina. In it, the promise of choice gleamed: stay and rebuild, or ride out to chase the next storm. Walker flashed a cocky grin, hoisted his rifle, and strode past them into the quiet hum of the depot dot as the stranger disappeared. Miralina wrapped her arm around Leandro's. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" He nodded slowly. "That peace has its own horizons, and maybe it's time I stopped being a legend in hiding." Her eyes glinted with both fear and adventure. "Then let's show the world what Whisper Valley stands for." They walked back toward the saloon, hand in hand, boots echoing on the wooden planks. Behind them, the train whistle sounded a new invitation to the bundled townsfolk rebuilding their lives. Between the promise of tomorrow and the echo of last night's gunfire, Whisper Valley's heart beat steady, a mother's hope, a ghost redeemed, and the endless horizon calling for more than simply survival. The afternoon sun sank low, casting Whisper Valley in a burnt gold light that softened the raw edges of last night's battle. Marilena Valdez stepped from the saloon's battered threshold, every footstep deliberate, as though she traced the valley's heartbeat beneath the boards. Her father's Winchester, polished anew, hung at her side, no longer simply a weapon, but a symbol of the town's will to survive. She paused by the oak tree, where new saplings had been planted in neat rows, their young leaves promising a spring no longer threatened by flame or gunfire. She knelt, running her fingers through the damp earth, feeling the pulse of fresh growth beneath her fingertips. Above her, a lark's song pierced the silence, a melody so incongruous against yesterday's thunder that it felt celestial dot behind. Leandro Devereux appeared, boots crunching softly on the gravel. He wore no sash now. The widow's blanket draped around his shoulders instead, an unspoken oath binding him to Marilena and the land she reclaimed. His scarred face softened as he watched her. "You always find beauty where I see ruin," he said. Quietly, Marilena straightened, brushing dirt from her skirt. Her smile was weary, but fierce. "Hope's roots run deeper than hatred," she replied. "Once it takes hold, no avalanche can bury it." He nodded, eyes tracing the line of the ridges where the last of the mercenary trails faded into the brush. "What now?" he asked. "We rebuild," she said, voice unwavering. "Not just walls and fences, but trust. A schoolhouse for the children, a proper well for the farmstead, and stories that remind us we've learned our worth." Across the street, Tomas Ramirez guided a team of ranchers hauling fresh lumber from the depot. Luke Heron, shotgun slung low, directed them with the same calm authority he'd used in the battle. Even the preacher, Father Alejo, supervised medical supplies being delivered from Carson Hill by the conductor himself. As they walked together down the boardwalk, Marilena spotted the stranger Jefferson Walker unpacking gear beside the train tracks. His rifle lay against the depot wall, but his gaze was drawn to the church spire and the new saplings around the orchard. He looked every bit the drifter, but his stance held a question. Would he stay or ride on? Marilena raised a hand in greeting. Walker tipped his hat and narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. In that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. His journey may yet lead him back to this unlikely sanctuary. Leandro and Marilena reached the center of town, where construction crews worked in unison to mend broken boards and stitch fresh nails into wounded doorframes. Sweat and sawdust mingled in the air, but laughter and banter rose above the clatter, the first music of peace. Father Alejo stepped forward, raising a wooden mallet high. "My friends," he began, voice strong, "we have tasted the bitterness of blood and the sweetness of redemption. Today we build not just for ourselves, but for every soul who dreams of breathing free air. Let these planks be our vow. We stand together, in life as in death, in joy as in sorrow. Amen." "Amen," the crowd echoed. Leandro slipped his hand into Marilena's, the weight of his revolver replaced by the warmth of her grip. "Together," he echoed. She looked toward the horizon, where a ribbon of mountains glowed with the promise of tomorrow. "Together," she affirmed. Above them, the sky turned rose and crimson, no longer a battleground, but a canvas for new beginnings. And in the tender hush of that twilight, Whisper Valley exhaled its first breath of peace, rising from the embers stronger than any legend and more real than any ghost. Weeks passed, and Whisper Valley healed in sunlight and laughter, the kind that stitches wounds closed better than any bandage. The schoolhouse's frame rose beside the chapel. Weeks passed, and Whisper Valley healed in sunlight and laughter, the kind that stitches wounds closed better than any bandage. The schoolhouse's frame rose beside the chapel, its windows catching the dawn like hopeful eyes. Saplings grew firm in the orchard, their leaves whispering secrets of new seasons. At night, lanterns flickered in windows while families gathered to share bread, stories, and the steady comfort of surviving together. Yet even in peace, shadows lingered. One late afternoon, as the horizon blazed orange with sunset, Marilena Valdez rode out to inspect the new fence line along the railroad embankment. Her chair-borne child shifted gently beneath her as she guided her mare down the dusty track. The iron rails glinted in the last light, humming with the distant promise of progress. She smiled to herself, imagining the child growing up with this. Valley is home, not a battleground. But when she reached the embankment, she found someone waiting. A tall figure in fine dust-stained clothes, standing atop a crate stamped with the Union Pacific's emblem. He wore a broad hat, trimmed with silver braid, and held a polished map case under one arm. At his side stood two men in tailored coats, eyes sharp as eagles. Marilena's heart tightened. She dismounted, hand hovering near the Winchester at her side. The stranger tipped his hat, revealing a gaunt face framed by graying sideburns. "Mrs. Valdez," he began, voice smooth as brandy, "I am Cornelius Thoreau, chief surveyor for the Iron Road Company. I bring official notice. This railroad right-of-way must expand. That orchard," he swept a gloved hand toward the young trees, "stands in the way of progress. I trust you understand the company's authority." Marilena's grip hardened on her saddle horn. She glanced at the saplings, the life they held. "That orchard feeds this town," she said quietly. "No right-of-way can replace what it gives." Tyrole's thin lips curved. "Feeding is commendable, but contracts signed in Carson Hill supersede sentiment. The company requires that land for a spur track to the west. You have 3 days to vacate, or the company's agents will do it for you." Behind Tyrell, the two men cracked their knuckles, smiles painted with menace. Marilena felt the child quicken inside her, as if sensing her mother's resolve. The iron road had been a symbol of connection whistling across prairies, knitting towns into the nation's spine. But here, it threatened to rip Whisper Valley's heart from the earth. She squared her shoulders. Dust-sheathed families gathered. Behind her, children clutching homemade toys, elders leaning on canes, all drawn by the confrontation's hush. Marilena raised her voice, clear as a church bell. "You want our orchard? You'll find dead men rooted to these trees. And a widow who won't bow." Tyrole's eyes gleamed with corporate calm. "Then consider this a transaction, Mrs. Valdez. 3 sunsets to decide whether your blood or your orchard will water our tracks." With that, he stepped back onto the crate and signaled his men. They lowered their hats, turned, and climbed into a hub-bound baggage car that rattled away. The rails hummed like a dying threat. Marilena watched the train fade into the distance, its whistle mournful against the valley's evening stillness. Families closed ranks around her, fear warring. With defiance in their eyes, she turned to Leandro Devereux, who had appeared silently at her side, his presence as steady as a cornerstone. He placed a hand on her clenched fist. 3 days, he said. "Then we ride west if we must, or we stand here like we did before." Marilena drew a breath that tasted of coal and courage. "We'll stand for every root, for every life you gave back to us." The lark overhead sang once, its song trembling with dusk's chill. And in the gathering shadows, Whisper Valley trembled on the brink again, this time faced not by gunslingers nor bounty hunters, but by the relentless. The dawn after the surveyor's ultimatum broke over Whisper Valley like a cracked promise. 3 days, they'd said. 3 days to surrender the orchard or face eviction by company guns, and the law's cold writ. But dawn brought no fear. It brought resolve. Marilena Valdez stood beside the oak sapling she'd planted with trembling hands, inspecting the youngest shoots for signs of strength. The wind carried the distant clang of hammering ranchers and shopkeepers repairing fence lines against an enemy more relentless than any gunslinger. Each nail driven, each board replaced, felt like a heartbeat in this valley's survival. By midday, the street filled with determined faces, father and son Mora pushing a wheelbarrow of supplies, old Mrs. Delgado handing out homemade bread. Blacksmith Isaac Finch forging stakes and sharpened pickaxes. Even Luke Heron, still bandaged from the second wave's wound, organized a militia drill behind the churchyard. His youth tempered by the last month's baptism and fire dot in the saloon. Leandro Devereux studied a tattered map spread across a table scarred by bullet holes, and spilt whiskey. Father Alejo paced softly, murmuring prayers for guidance. Tomas. Ramirez leaned in, pointing to survey markers placed at Orchard's edge. They've started staking again, he said, voice low but steady. By tomorrow's sunset, they'll press our backs to this fence. Miralina tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, eyes glowing with fierce determination. We'll need distraction, she said, voice firm. Draw them away from the saplings. I'll lead a small party at dusk, burn the markers, scatter the stakes. Meanwhile, you fortify the barricades. Her gaze flicked to Leandro. Are you with me? He met her eyes, scarred jaw set. Where you go, I go. We end this together, my gun, your grit, and the valley's heart. He folded the map, slipping it into his coat dot as dusk fell. A lantern-lit procession slipped into the orchard. Miralina led the way, rifle slung at her back, joined by Luke and 2 ranchers. The moon peeked through broken clouds, illuminating survey stakes that glowed like pale sentinels. With precise strikes, they uprooted each marker. With reckless courage, they burned the papers declaring Iron Road Company's claim. But as the last marker collapsed in a crackling inferno, the distant rumble of horses rose in the still air. Torches bobbed on the ridge above, the company's men, 10 strong, rifles ready. Behind them, Judge Harlow rode in uneasy silence, his satchel now empty and eyes haunted by the explosion that had killed his authority. Miralina's heart hammered as she raised her voice to her companions. Scatter to cover. She cried. Bullets shattered the orchard's hush. Luke's shotgun roared in reply. The ranchers ducked behind saplings, axes lifted as makeshift shields. In the chaos, Miralina felt her babies kick sharp, insistent. A reminder that this was more than a battle for dirt. Leandro emerged from the shadows, Colt in hand. His shot cut the night one rider pitched from his saddle. But the remaining mercenaries pressed forward, ringed by the law's hollow sanction and the railroad's steel-backed creed. The final horizon glowed red with torches, and Judge Harlow called out above the fusillade. Enough blood. Surrender now, and no more lives will be lost. Miralina inhaled cold night air, muscles coiled for the next moment. Across the scarred orchard, saplings swayed like silent witnesses. One choice remained. Bow to the iron promise of tracks or stand again, bloodied but unbroken. And as the valley held its breath, Miralina Valdez raised her rifle one last time and pulled the trigger. The night after the orchard skirmish descended with a heavy stillness. Whisper Valley, its wooden facades scarred by fire and lead, breathed as if trying to shake off the night's violence. A raw wind swept down the main street, rattling shutters, and stirring snow into drifting clouds that glimmered in the pale moonlight. Miralina Valdez stood on the porch of her battered home, the remains of the orchard's boundary maples swaying behind her like silent sentinels. She placed her hand on the freshly milled boards, feeling the grain under her palm, the texture of survival itself. Beside her, her husband, now not simply the legendary prairie shadow whose real name only a few knew, Leandro Devereux, carried a wrapped bundle of cloth. Within it, a roll of maps and papers describing property lines disputed by men of iron and steel. He laid it on the porch railing, his gaze searching hers. "We know what they'll do," he said, voice low as a far-off thunder. "They've got a company army behind them this time. Local deputies, hired guns, even a few mercenaries unpaid. They'll come at dawn, at full strength." Miralina nodded, breath visible in the cold. "We've had 10 days, she replied softly. 10 days to strengthen every fence, to teach every volunteer to fire true. But this ends tomorrow. A distant whistle trilled like the freight train, carrying whispers of vengeance down from Carson Hill, cutting their half-formed resolve into sharp focus. Father Alejo, wrapped in his threadbare shawl, emerged from the darkened apse of the chapel, eyes downcast but determined. "Marilena, go rest," he urged gently, crossing himself. "Blood has marked your hands enough." She placed her daughter's first baby bonnet in his hands, hand-sewn from an old calico dress, and shook her head. "No, this has to be our fight. My child's cradle is here." She laid her palm on her belly where the new life kicked insistently, as if demanding its turn at destiny's wheel. Father Alejo sighed, but he did not argue. Instead, he took a battered lantern and led the way inside the darkened saloon. Its bar broken, bottles shattered on the floor. Leandro assembled the volunteer defense roster. By now, every able-bodied man and woman in Whisper Valley had taken up arms. Ranch hands with Winchester rifles, shopkeepers with shotguns borrowed from the preacher, and schoolboys hoisting ammunition belts over their shoulders. Leandro's presence at the head of the long, scarred table silenced the saloon's usual creaks and moans. Candlelight sputtered, reflecting off the brass candlesticks, blackening the footprints of so many confrontations. "Listen close," he said, voice carrying the authority of a man born to command. "Tomorrow, the company's men will come through the East Pass. Their vanguard will be mounted sharpshooters' rifles, accurate beyond most of us at more than 100 paces. He flattened a hand on the map. "We'll pin them here at the ridge where the draw narrows and the saplings are thick enough to break line of sight." A ranch hand ran a gaunt finger along a drawn path. "Then what?" he asked, voice rough with fatigue. Marilena spoke for Leandro's plan. "When they pause, thinking the ridge clear, our flank guard, Ryan O'Shea's crew, will spring from the orchard line, forcing them back. All the while, Tomas and Luke will pick off their horses with shotgun slugs at close range. Without mounts, they lose speed. Without speed, they face the rest of us." Tomas Ramirez leaned forward, scar still raw on his cheek. "The cavalry charge almost broke us once. Now, they'll be unhorsed, bogged down in mud. We make them wade through frozen mire." The preacher closed his Bible. "And the orchard?" Marilena's eyes shone. "This orchard will stand as the point that holds the line. Every tree, every fence post, every root is our anchor. If it falls, we scatter. If it stands, they leave. Whisper Valley haunted forever by ghosts that will not yield ground." A murmur of assent rippled through the gathered volunteers. Even in this grim room, the embers of hope glinted hot against the darkness. Leandro raised his hand. "Tomorrow, dawn, we finish what we started. Whisper Valley must live. Whisper Valley lives." They echoed, fists thudding on rough-hewn wood. The final hours before dawn were filled with quiet preparations. Mares hobbled around the barnyard, ammunition belts checked, rifles cleaned and oiled. Mothers laid out boiled coffee in tin cups, bread for the battle ahead. In the chapel, Father Alejo blessed each cartridge, murmuring prayers as he traced the sign of the cross over every shining bullet. Marilena knelt by the oak cradle she'd built, untested but strong, where her husband's bandana lay folded, a sign that these two lives were one. She placed her hand over the wood, whispering a lullaby her grandmother had sung to her on nights when storms rattled the shutters. The melody was old as time, carrying comfort in its worn notes. A knock sounded. Leandro at the door, his face eased into a rare softness. He knelt beside her, offering a cup of steaming coffee. She drank, the warmth searing through her bones. "We ride at first light," he said softly. The weight of his words carried a world of possibilities. Marilena reached for his hand. "I'm not afraid." He covered her hand with his. "Faith isn't the absence of fear," he said. "It's our choice to face it." The crescent moon dipped below the horizon, and in that moment of perfect darkness, the first horn sounded from the east. Marilena rose, Resolve steelhard once again. They stood at the edge of the orchard, side by side, rifles raised. Dawn would spill blood. But in that new light, a promise hung thick between them. Whisper Valley would not fall. Day broke soft and golden over Whisper Valley, painting the battered streets in shades of promise. At the center of town, beside the Silver Star Saloon's scarred facade, the final embers of last night's blaze smoldered against the light. Where gunfire had echoed, now rose an anthem of hammers and saws, laughter and prayer, a cadence of rebirth. Marilena Valdez stood where the dawn touched the saloon's wooden sill, her silhouette framed by swirling dust motes and the gentle sway of the wind. In her arms rested the newest life of Whisper Valley, a son with his father's eyes and his mother's fierce spirit. His first cry, strong, insistent, rang through the quiet street like a call to arms for an era of peace. Leandro de Veru knelt beside her, brushing a curl from her brow before lifting the infant so the sun could gild his hair. "He's ours," she whispered, voice thick with awe. "Our future is ours to shape." He met her gaze, gratitude burning in his pale blue eyes. "And we'll keep it safe every sunrise after this. We'll fight for him, but with words, not bullets." Behind them, the town gathered, builders, farmers, shopkeepers, and children, all drawn by the infant's cry and the promise it heralded. Even Father Alejo stepped from the background, cradling his own tan-striped robe, tears bright on his cheeks. "Amen," he murmured, raising his battered Bible to the sky. Marilena and Leandro rose together. The baby nestled between them like a flag of hope. The saloon doors creaked as townsfolk filled the porch, hats in hand, smiles tentative but growing with each heartbeat of unity. Leandro cleared his throat, voice carrying easily through the morning calm. "We faced every storm, gunslingers, mercenaries, the law's heavy hand, even the iron rails threatening to carve our land away. But we stood shoulder to shoulder, because this valley belonged to its people, not to any legend or promise made." In the halls of distant power, a gentle nod passed among the crowd. Tomas Ramirez, now bandage-free, stepped forward with a basket of fresh apples from the orchard, sweet fruit born of soil baptized in sacrifice. Marilena lifted an apple, the skin mottled red and gold like the valley's sunrise. She broke it and offered half to her husband. He bit into it, the crisp sweetness a testament to trials overcome. Behind them, Luke Heron marched in parade, rifle slung but decorated with wildflowers tied at the barrel, symbol of a young man no longer defined by gunfire, but by the future he would help build. The stranger, Jefferson Walker, approached next, a faint grin on his sun-weathered face. He tipped his hat to Marilena's child, then to the parents. "I reckon stories of Whisper Valley deserve their own journey," he said. "When you're ready for a new trail, I'll ride with you." His eyes held the spark of adventure tempered by reverence. Marilena's gaze flicked to Leandro, then back to Walker. "We've learned one truth. Home is where our hearts stand. But when these streets rest easy, we'll ride toward horizons that welcome the brave and the kind." Walker nodded solemnly. "Then may every mile you travel be as safe as these streets have become." As the morning sun climbed higher, the valley exhaled its first sigh of unburdened air. The church bell tolled once clear, joyous, as the schoolhouse's new bell remained silent, reserved for lessons ahead rather than alarms of war. Marilena knelt beside her husband, hands brushing their son's cheek. "This is more than an ending," she said softly. "It's our beginning." Leandro lifted the infant to the sun, arms steady. "Tomorrow we teach him what we fought for, that courage blooms best in hearts unbroken, and that peace is the greatest legend we can leave behind." The crowd murmured its agreement, the valley's heartbeat echoing in every thump of the infant's chest. Above them, the sky stretched wide and welcoming, no longer a battlefield but a promise, each cloud a sail on the breeze of a future earned. And in the Silver Star Saloon's doorway, Marilena Valdez smiled, the prairie winds folding her, hair around her like a cloak. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.